For most of the world, Harpo Marx existed without a voice. He was the silent storm of the Marx Brothers, the wild figure who communicated through movement, horns, whistles, and sudden bursts of physical chaos. Audiences laughed because he never spoke, and over time, silence became his identity. It felt natural, even inevitable, as if Harpo had always been meant to exist without words. But that image was never the full truth. Harpo Marx was not silent by nature. He could speak, and he did speak, often and clearly in private. What makes this fact unsettling is that for decades, almost no one heard that voice. It stayed locked away, hidden behind a carefully protected public image. When unreleased audio recordings surfaced years after his death, they revealed a man who sounded nothing like the character people thought they knew. The voice was calm, controlled, thoughtful, and at times surprisingly serious. Hearing it feels strange, almost wrong, because it breaks an illusion that lasted for more than half a century. The shock of that voice does not come from how loud or unusual it was. It comes from how human it sounds. Harpo's public image was built on exaggerated motion and constant disruption. He chased people, destroyed props, stole objects, and turned polite scenes into chaos. That kind of performance makes it easy to forget the person underneath. In the recordings, there is no frantic energy, no clownish urgency. Instead, there is patience. There is reflection. There is a man who pauses before answering questions and chooses his words carefully. This contrast forces listeners to reconsider everything they thought they knew about him. Silence, it turns out, was not an absence. It was a decision. Those recordings also hint at why Harpo guarded his voice so carefully. His silence on stage gave him freedom. Without words, he could escape judgment, misunderstanding, and expectation. He could be anything the audience wanted him to be. The moment he spoke, that freedom would disappear. A voice fixes a person in place. It reveals age, background, emotion, and intention. Harpo understood that better than most performers. By refusing to speak, he avoided being defined in ways that might limit him. The audio recordings make it clear that this choice was not accidental or forced on him. It was a shield he built for himself over time. Tio understand why that shield mattered so much. It is necessary to look back at where Harpo came from. He was born on November 23rd, 1888, in New York City, into a world that offered very little comfort or safety. His birth name was Adolphe Marx, and his family lived at 179 East 93rd Street in the Yorkville neighborhood of Manhattan. The address alone tells a story. It was a cramped tenement, packed with immigrant families who struggled to survive in small, overcrowded rooms. There was little heat in winter, little air in summer, and no privacy at any time. For the Marx family, poverty was not temporary or abstract. It was a daily condition that shaped every decision they made. Harpo's parents carried European roots from places like Alsace and East Frisia, but in New York, that history meant nothing. His father, Sam Marx, known as Frenchie, worked whatever jobs he could find. He was a tailor, a peddler, and an odd job worker, constantly moving from one opportunity to the next just to keep food on the table. Even with that effort, the family survived on less than $10 a week during the 1890s. That amount forced impossible choices. Something always had to be given up. Warmth, food, clothing, or rest. One of them was always missing. The building itself became the center of Harpo's early world. The Marx family lived there for 14 years, long enough for Harpo to grow from a baby into a teenager without ever knowing what it felt like to have space. Children slept 3 to a bed. During holidays, Christmas stockings were hung in the air shaft because there was nowhere else to put them. The street was not something outside the home. It was part of it. Noise, danger, and constant movement surrounded him from the beginning. Growing up in that environment did not gently shape a child. It hardened him. It taught him to observe quickly, react instantly, and survive without asking for help. Those instincts would later become the foundation of his comedy, long before anyone realized what they were watching as he grew older. If anything, it became sharper and more demanding. By the time he was 4 years old, he was already learning how to navigate the dangers of the streets around Yorkville. This was not a childhood filled with protection or patience. It was a childhood built on necessity. Children were expected to contribute, and Harpo did whatever he could. He ran errands, sold newspapers, and learned quickly which corners were safe and which ones were not. Gangs, petty crime, and sudden violence were part of the daily landscape. For Harpo, danger was not an event. It was a condition. When you grow up like that, fear becomes background noise. You stop reacting to it emotionally and start responding to it physically. That instinct would later define his entire performance style. School offered no escape. Instead of safety, it brought humiliation. Harpo was bullied relentlessly, especially for being Jewish. The cruelty went far beyond insults. One incident stayed with him for the rest of his life. When a teacher stepped out of the classroom, several students grabbed Harpo and threw him out of a second-story window. He survived, but the message was clear. The world was not fair, and authority could not always be trusted to protect you. He struggled academically as well, failing second grade twice. By the age of 8, he quit school entirely. That decision closed one door forever. He would never gain the confidence that comes from formal education. He would never rely on books or rules to guide him. Instead, he learned to depend on observation, timing, and instinct. Those skills would later make him brilliant on stage, but at the time, they were simply tools for survival. Work filled the space that school left behind. Harpo joined his older brother Chico selling newspapers on freezing street corners, shouting headlines to passing strangers. He took on odd jobs whenever possible, delivering meat, running errands for offices, and helping in small shops around Carnegie Hill. One experience in a butcher shop became especially important. While carrying a heavy meat carcass, Harpo dropped it, causing chaos. Dogs rushed toward him, snapping and barking, and he had to move fast to avoid getting hurt. The panic of that moment burned itself into his body. Years later, that same quick movement, that same sharp reaction, would appear on stage as perfectly timed physical comedy. The fear turned into rhythm. The danger turned into precision. Without knowing it, Harpo was already training for the role that would make him famous. Then his body betrayed him. At the age of 10, Harpo contracted typhoid fever from contaminated water, a common danger in poor neighborhoods at the time. The illness nearly killed him. He was bedridden for months, weak and isolated, cut off from the noise and movement that had always surrounded him. For a child used to constant motion, the silence was heavy. It forced him inward. He had time to think, to imagine, and to notice details he might otherwise have missed. That period of sickness changed him. When he finally recovered, he was not the same child. The world felt distant, and he needed something to pull himself back into it. That something was music, not in the traditional sense, and not through proper instruction. The Marx family could only afford music lessons for one child, and that was Chico. Harpo was left to figure things out on his own. Still, sound drew him in. He wanted to feel it, to touch it, to understand it physically. He would sneak into a neighbor's home just to place his hands on a harp. He had no sheet music, no teacher, and no clear guidance. He taught himself by copying an image he once saw of a harp-playing angel in a five-and-dime store. He tuned the instrument by ear because he could not read music. For 3 years, he played with the strings tuned incorrectly without realizing it. When he finally discovered the mistake, he did not correct it. The unusual tuning reduced tension on the strings and gave the harp a softer, stranger sound. That mistake became his signature. Music became more than a skill. It became a refuge. It allowed Harpo to express emotion without speaking, without explaining himself, and without risking judgment. At a time when words had often failed him or brought him pain, sound offered a safer path. That relationship with music would stay with him for life, weaving quietly through his comedy and shaping moments of beauty that audiences did not always expect. Long before the world saw him as a silent clown, Harpo Marx had already learned how powerful silence and sound could be when used together. While Harpo was learning survival through the streets and discovering music on his own, another powerful force was shaping his future inside the home. That force was his mother, Minnie Marx. Minnie was not gentle, and she was not patient. She viewed childhood as a limited resource, something that could not be wasted. In her mind, the world outside their tenement was unforgiving, and survival depended on discipline, effort, and timing. She believed the stage was the only real escape from poverty. This belief did not come from fantasy. Her brother, Al Sheen, had found success in vaudeville, and many saw his career as proof that performance could lift a family out of hardship. From that moment on, she pushed her sons toward entertainment with relentless focus. Practice was not optional in the Marx household. Many demanded long rehearsals and absolute commitment. Mistakes were not treated as learning opportunities, but as obstacles that had to be beaten down. Sometimes she locked the boys in a room until routines were perfected. In her mind, strict control at home was kinder than the cruelty waiting for them outside. The cost of that control was high. The boys missed the easy parts of childhood. They argued about money and direction far earlier than most children their age. Tension became normal. Harpo felt that pressure deeply, and it showed in one of the most humiliating moments of his early life. When Minnie forced Harpo onto a stage the first time, fear overwhelmed him. Standing in front of an audience, exposed and uncertain, his body reacted before his mind could catch up. He wet his pants in front of everyone. The audience laughed, but not in the way Minnie wanted. For Harpo, the moment was devastating. It stayed with him not as a funny memory, but as a wound. It taught him how dangerous words and expectations could be. Yet Minnie did not slow down. She believed pain now could mean survival later. Slowly, Harpo began to understand something important. When words failed him, his body could still communicate. When fear threatened to take control, he could turn it into a physical gag. That realization would eventually become the foundation of his entire public identity. That be why the early 1900s, the stage stopped being a dream and became work. In 1902, at just 14 years old, Adolph Marx entered professional performance life as part of the Leroy Trio. The act was managed by Minnie, and it was built around song and dance routines. They traveled constantly, moving from town to town, performing in small theaters where conditions were rough and pay was uncertain. They rode trains, slept in cheap boarding houses, and played to crowds that could be harsh or indifferent. Harpo often served as a straight man beside Chico's energetic piano playing. He still had no formal training in music or comedy, but he had presence. He had timing. And once he heard real laughter, something inside him clicked. That sound gave him a reason to keep going. As the years passed, the grind intensified. By 1906, Harpo joined the Gus Edwards Postal Telegraph Boys, a traveling act built around young performers. He toured as a boy soprano, performing in shows that included blackface, which was treated as normal entertainment at the time, despite its deeply harmful stereotypes. The makeup was uncomfortable, the schedule exhausting, and audiences were not always kind. Sometimes they jeered. Sometimes they threw objects. Stage time, however, is a brutal teacher. It does not care about your comfort or your feelings. It forces adaptation. Harpo learned quickly how to read a room, how to adjust his movement, and how to recover when something went wrong. By 1908, the act changed again. Harpo and his brothers formed a group called the Four Nightingales. The tone shifted from straight singing toward comedy and satire. They began mocking high society and poking fun at pretension. In the middle of this transition, Harpo discovered something by accident. When he forgot lines, he filled the gaps with exaggerated gestures and physical movement. Instead of losing the audience, he captured their attention. Big expressions, sharp timing, and sudden bursts of motion turned mistakes into highlights. That was the moment the silent Harpo began to emerge, not as a planned character, but as a survival strategy that worked too well to ignore. The road continued to test him. In 1910, during a run in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, a fire destroyed their props and costumes. Overnight, they lost nearly everything they relied on. There was no time to rebuild properly. The show had to go on. They improvised, leaning on chaos instead of polish. It was embarrassing and shocking, but it revealed something essential. When disaster strikes, some performers freeze. The Marx Brothers learned how to turn disaster into fuel. That ability would carry them through the brutal world of vaudeville and beyond, shaping a style that thrived on disorder and surprise. The harsh lessons of the road did not stop with lost props or hostile audiences. In 1912, Harpo Marx experienced one of the most brutal moments of his early career, a moment that permanently altered how he viewed the world. During a stop in Texas, the act failed badly. The audience refused to pay, and without money or local support, Harpo was arrested for vagrancy. At the time, traveling performers were easy targets for authorities, especially when they were poor, unfamiliar, and had no power. Overnight, Harpo went from entertainer to criminal in the eyes of strangers. He spent a night in jail, and during that night, he was beaten by local thugs. The violence was sudden and unprovoked. It left him shaken, injured, and deeply changed. Many paid the bail the next day and got him out, but the damage was already done. Experiences like that do not fade easily. They reshape how a person understands authority, safety, and trust. That night taught Harpo a lesson he carried for the rest of his life. Authority could be unfair. Rules did not always protect the innocent. Laughter, which had once felt like an escape, now became a kind of armor. When people later saw Harpo as a wild, uncontrollable force on stage, they were seeing the result of years spent learning how to survive unpredictable systems. His comedy was not random. It was defensive. It was a way to stay one step ahead of danger by creating confusion before someone else could control the situation. Despite everything, the work continued. In January of 1910, Harpo officially joined his older brothers Julius and Milton, who the world would later know as Groucho and Gummo. At first, they were just a small singing act, moving from town to town, chasing applause wherever they could find it. They were not famous, and they were not polished. They were hungry. A few years later, a simple mistake changed their identity forever. A Chicago critic misspelled their name in a review, calling them the Marx Brothers instead of the Four Nightingales. The name stuck. By 1915, they were headlining on the Keith and Orpheum circuits, some of the biggest vaudeville stages in the country. As their popularity grew, so did the chaos of their act. It was no longer neat or polite. It was disorder by design. Harpo became the storm inside that disorder. He chased chorus girls across the stage, interrupted scenes with sudden noises, and broke the rhythm of performances just to see how the audience would react. He carried a harp, an instrument that felt completely out of place in comedy, yet somehow made perfect sense in his hands. His nickname came from that harp, and the image stuck. During World War I, while many acts struggled to survive, the Marx Brothers continued to draw crowds. Harpo filled his oversized coat with impossible objects, pulling out items that made no sense and did not need to. The audience did not ask why. They simply laughed at first. Harpo spoke on stage like everyone else. His silence was not original or planned. Directors noticed that his line delivery felt awkward and often disrupted the timing of scenes. Instead of trying to fix it, the brothers made a bold decision. Around 1917, they turned Harpo into a mute character. What looked like a weakness became his greatest strength. Without words, he gained freedom. He could communicate through looks, movement, horns, whistles, and sudden bursts of action. Against Groucho's rapid-fire speech and Chico's musical energy, Harpo became pure motion. The contrast sharpened the entire act by the time they reached Broadway in 1924 with I'll Say She Is. Harpo's silence felt essential rather than accidental. His pantomime routines were not filler. They were highlights. One scene, in which he slowly pretended to steal silverware from a society dinner, stopped the show night after night. Applause interrupted the performance. That single routine reportedly earned him about $1,500 a week, a massive sum at the time. Celebrities returned again and again just to watch it. The silence that once protected him now defined him. Behind the scenes, the environment was still chaotic. Rehearsals were messy. Injuries were common. Many even broke her ankle before opening night, but continued managing from a stretcher. Nothing seemed capable of slowing them down. The momentum carried directly into the Coconuts in 1925, where Harpo played a harp-playing thief in a hotel filled with madness. He improvised constantly, even flooding the stage with real fire hoses during one rehearsal, nearly shutting production down. Producers were furious. Audiences did not care. The show ran for hundreds of performances and made the Marx Brothers stars in New York. Harpo's refusal to play safe had become his signature, and the world was finally paying attention as the Marx Brothers moved from stage to screen, Harpo Marx carried his chaos with him into a new world that was still figuring out what movies could be. Film demanded precision, repetition, and control, qualities that did not naturally fit Harpo's instinctive style. Yet that tension is exactly what made his performances so electric. In Animal Crackers in 1928, Harpo's presence felt untamed. He chased Margaret Dumont through scenes meant to represent high society, turned nonsense into a language of his own, and even played a violin with a saw, transforming absurdity into something strangely elegant. At his peak on Broadway, Harpo earned around $2,000 a week, a fortune for time. Critics struggled to describe what they were seeing. Words failed them in the same way words had failed Harpo years earlier. All replaced explanation. Success, however, did not bring stability. Behind the curtain, Harpo lived just as wildly as he performed. He chased women relentlessly, often hiding affairs with chorus girls while his married brothers quietly helped cover for him. Tempers flared. Tires were slashed. Rehearsals turned tense. In one infamous incident, Harpo crossed a dangerous line by exposing himself to an understudy as a joke. A formal complaint followed, and the production nearly collapsed. Florence Ziegfeld stepped in and quietly paid to keep the story out of newspapers. The silence around that moment lasted for decades, protected by power and money. It was a reminder that the entertainment industry had its own rules, and accountability often depended on fame. Hollywood arrived in full force in 1929 with the film version of The Coconuts. The Marx Brothers filmed during the day at Paramount's Astoria Studios and performed Animal Crackers on Broadway at night. Days stretched to 18 hours.